mined in East Asia, in Alaska. Gold is mined in the nearshore zone. We know about significant marine phosphates in New Zealand and Namibia, and this is an important input for agricultural fertilizers. These are not being mined yet, but there is certainly exploration and interest in developing these. And then we have the deep sea minerals. Now, some of these deep sea minerals are also found in exclusive economic zones, and I'll come back to that in a second. Indeed, it's probably worth mentioning that the first commercial scale deep seabed mining that we're likely to see, probably around 2018, is actually will occur within the exclusive economic zone of Papua New Guinea. Right, so very quickly, there's three basic types of polymetallic, of deep seabed minerals. I'll run through them very quickly because it adds to a point I want to make later. Polymetallic nodules, these are found on the abyssal plains, and they're about potato-sized. Maybe to jump back a second, it's very important to realize that the seabed has a geography of its own. Once you move past the continental shelf, we have vast plains. These are the flat abyssal plains that I've been talking about. You have seamounts, which are essentially undersea mountains, if you can call them that. And then we have spaces of intense geological activity. I guess you could equate them with underwater volcanoes, really, and that has an impact on these different minerals. So I've said the polymetallic nodules are found on the abyssal plains. Cobalt-rich crusts are found on these seamounts, on these underwater mountains, and then seafloor massive sulfides are found in these vents and along the mid-oceanic ridge. The reason I made this quick introduction is because there's a very important point about when we talk about governing seabed mining, and that is that it's very difficult to make general statements about how we proceed in governing these minerals and considering the environmental impact of these activities. Each of these environments that I've described, the plains, the seamounts, the mid-oceanic ridges, have their own ecology, their own life systems. There's different concerns related to that. The biomass on abyssal plains is very low. There's not much life there, but there's a great level of biodiversity, different species, very unique species, and these are very stable systems. These polymetallic nodules that I've talked about take literally millions of years to grow. So on a human time scale, once you've removed them from the seabed, you've changed that ecosystem forever. That doesn't mean you've destroyed all life in that region, but the life that has adapted to that particular environment can no longer exist there. Seamounts are, again, very rich in biodiversity, often topped by coral reefs, and there's a real concern about the impact of mining these areas, as indeed there are of fishing activities around these seamounts. And then the seafloor massive sulfides is a very interesting environment because the life there is very unique. It exists only in that space. In fact, the energy for those ecosystems actually relies on the heat and the chemicals that are released through those vents, not through photosynthesis, as we find in pretty much any other ecosystem on the planet. Right, so just quickly, as I've said, seabed mining in the area is governed by the International Seabed Authority. It's already developed guidelines for exploration. It's now moving towards developing guidelines for exploitation. I guess the point to make there, I was at an International Seabed Authority conference just last week, is that the countries of the Indian Ocean region, with an interest in seabed mining, and India is certainly one of them, has to be part of these discussions. I think there are still some very fundamental questions to be asked as we develop this regulatory regime around governance, transparency, but also environmental responsibility. Just before that Seabed Authority conference, I was at a conference in Madagascar looking at the blue economy from East Africa's perspective. And there we had some presentations indeed about India's experience in developing technology and deep sea research, looking at actually exploiting polymetallic nodules, deep seabed mining. And there was a huge interest in sharing lessons in terms of skills development. And I think that's really an area that, that we can look at as the IORA, but particularly for India. Okay, I'll take a minute or two to wrap up. My organization, the South African Institute of International Affairs, the program I work in is the Governance of Africa's Resources program. We do research across a range of natural resource sector, terrestrial mining, fisheries, forestry, the blue economy, and you find certain governance principles that cut across all these different sectors. That is issues of transparency, issues of equity, the question of the fiscal take, taxation, essentially, what comes to the state, value addition as industries contribute to jobs and industrialization, skills development and technological transfer, and of course, environmental responsibility.